Welcome to the ISS. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Matthew Harries. I'm managing editor of the Institute's journal Survival and a research fellow here. We have with us authors of two books on the US-Israeli relationship, which are important contributions, I think, to the literature, but which were both written before the election of Donald Trump. So I think in our discussion today, I hope what we can get at is a combination of both the longer-term trends in the US-Israeli relationship, but also the extent to which those trends might change or be disrupted by the shocking election result. I'll briefly introduce our speakers before we begin. We have an hour in total, and I hope that'll leave us plenty of time for discussion. I should say before we start that we're on the record, and actually we're either being streamed or about to be streamed on Periscope, so hello world. And I think an audio recording will be posted on the ISS website either later today or tomorrow. On Monday, I suppose. Dr. Jonathan Reinhold is a professor in the Political Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University, and he's a senior researcher at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. His book, to which I referred, is The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture, published in 2005, which won the Israeli... 15, which won the Israeli Association for Political Science Prize of that year. Dana Allin, to my left, is editor of Survival and senior fellow here at the Institute for US Foreign Policy and Transatlantic Affairs. He is the co-author with Stephen Simon of Our Separate Ways, The Struggle for the Future of the US-Israel Alliance. Jonathan, why don't you start?
How long do you want me to speak then?
Let's do about 10 to 15 minutes each.
Sure.
That leaves us plenty of time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dana and the IISS and Fathom Journal and Alan for inviting me to come and speak. If you want to understand how Israel looks at the world right now, I think we could say it would go something like this. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most dysfunctional polity of them all? Not Israel, it turns out. And so Israelis are feeling, in relative terms, quite pleased with ourselves because it turns out we're not the only one with a crazy political system that produces bizarre results. If we look at the election of Donald Trump and what it means for US-Israeli relations, I think that we can sum it up by saying that the likelihood is it will be a smoother relationship than with the Obama administration, but that my sense is that in an underlying way, Israel may actually be less secure, and that's not because there'll be a massive break with the policies of the Obama administration, although there will be in some respects. It will be that in a certain respect there'll be greater continuity, and continuity in a way that is more problematic as the US plays less of a leadership role, or is likely to play less of a leadership role than it has done in the past, particularly since 1945, obviously. The bottom line, though, is that US-Israeli relations will remain close, they'll remain special, because they're larger than any single political actor. Netanyahu and Obama do not get on personally. They have different strategic visions, and there is very poor communication between the two governments. Nonetheless, Israel just signed a huge aid deal worth $38 billion with the Obama administration. So what that tells us, along with the fact that American public opinion is more pro-Israel now than it has ever been consistently, it tells us that the special relationship is likely to continue. There is unlikely to be any breakdown in that, at least in the foreseeable future. On the other hand, when we look at not just the relationship in a sense, yes, there's institutionalized cooperation and there's aid and there's public support, but if we look at it in terms of what affects practical policy towards issues, then of course this is affected by other things that do change. And those things are domestic politics in each country and the different strategic outlooks that each side takes, and particularly obviously Washington, since Washington is more important than Jerusalem. So if we look when support for Israel rises or falls, aid to Israel is increased by a factor of 10 in 1970-71 because Israel helps the United States deal with a crisis in Jordan. There's no change in public support. There's no change in the power of pro-Israel lobby AIPAC in that year. 1973 to 75 is another huge jump in support in strategic cooperation between Israel and the United States, but also great pressure put by the United States on Israel because, once again, Israel in this context is being pressured to withdraw from part of Sinai in order to bring Egypt onto America's side in the Cold War and change the balance of power. So strategy matters. So what's going on with these two issues now? Well, look, domestic politics in America is being characterized by greater party and ideological polarization than at any time since 1945. And that polarization, if we look at the issues on which they're most polarized, foreign policy is that issue. And if we look at where foreign policy is focused, it's on the Middle East. The big questions are Iran and Iraq. And of course, Israel is in the Middle East. It's part of those equations. And so it has become a subject. Policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict has become a subject that divides greatly the parties. It's not sympathy for Israel, because if we look at Democrats and Republicans, yes, Republicans are far more sympathetic to Israel than Democrats, but Democrats are sympathetic to Israel by a factor of 2 to 1, and that's stayed very consistent, and it's a completely different picture from that in Europe. There are issues with younger liberals and their relationship to Israel, but that's something that will take considerable time to play out politically, although it's already evident within the Democratic Party and within the struggle over the Democratic Party platform for this presidential election. But of course, as we know, it's the Republicans who are in power, a Republican president, a Republican Congress, and Republican positions on major issues to do with Israel, be it Palestinian statehood, be it settlements, be it a more assertive policy towards Iran. If we look at Republican attitudes of voters or members of Congress or those who stood for the presidency, they are all closer to the positions of Netanyahu than was the Obama administration or the Democrats. And therefore, one would think that would mean there'll be a smoother relationship between the two leaders. Except that if that was the case, Mr. Netanyahu would not have signed a $38 billion aid deal with the Obama administration on terms that are worse than the previous aid deal for Israel. He did that because he's also not sure whether, in an underlying strategic sense, the Trump administration is good for Israel. First of all, who knows, what Mr. Trump really thinks, if he indeed has a clear idea about what he thinks about the Middle East. He has no record. He's not a politician. He said, and his advisor said, contradictory things throughout the campaign. He's an erratic in general. So it's very difficult to know. Will he seek to do the deal that nobody else has done, the Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, which he said, and be neutral, or will he move the embassy to Jerusalem? Does he even realise that you can't do one without the other? You can't do one and the other. And of course the Iran deal as well. He said contradictory things in the campaign. But if I was to say, what is it about Mr. Trump that might give Mr. Netanyahu sleepless nights, I would say it's to do with his overall strategy. Now, Mr. Trump said lots of contradictory things in the campaign, but there was a consistent instinct about how to look at the world. And that instinct is what Walter Russell Mead, the American academic, would call Jacksonian, after Andrew Jackson. And that is a combination, which we haven't really seen recently, of being on the one hand very assertive and very willing to use military force, and on the other hand quite isolationist, unwilling to lead globally, not just a liberal world order, any world order. What do I care what goes on in the Ukraine? Let the Russians play the role there. What do I care what goes on in Syria? Let the Russians and even the Iranians deal with it. Questioning your NATO allies. Okay? America first. America first resonates in terms of something said in the 1930s by Republican senators who were isolationists. And if you know Mr. Netanyahu, you'll know that he spends a lot of time in the 1930s. Okay? And that's what worries him, and that's what worried him. He used that metaphor a lot about the Iran deal. So he would have been sensitive to that side of things. It's also noticeable that Mr. Trump's first statement was, those countries that want to get along with us, we'll get along with them. In other words, if you don't make trouble for me, I won't make trouble for you. Which again is not the language of global leadership. And what does this mean for US-Israel relations? So yes, it's true that Mr. Trump said he's going to smash ISIS, Daesh, right? But for Israel, ISIS is secondary concern. It's Iran that's the main concern. And if you say that you want the Russians to take the lead in Syria, you don't care what happens, then what you're saying is the Russians, who may be doing a $10 billion arms deal with Iran, will be creating an umbrella under which Iran's power can grow. So on the one hand, you're telling the Israelis, we're gonna either end the Iran deal or we're going to enforce it more strictly. On the other hand, what you're implicitly saying is we're going to give the Iranians an umbrella under which they can get stronger, and therefore, if there comes a time when you have to confront them, they will be in a stronger position to cause more damage. Then there's the whole question of the peace process. So it's all very nice to say, on the one hand, you want to do the deal that no one can do, or on the other hand, you're going to just leave it and let the sides do whatever they want. It's not our problem if Israel wants to build more settlements. It's not our problem what happens in the Palestinian Authority. But the interesting thing is we're probably at more of a consensus that there isn't really an opportunity to reach a permanent status deal. But equally, we're at a consensus that if you just allow things to roll on the way they're going to go, you won't be managing the conflict, you'll be making it more difficult to manage and more difficult to resolve. So if you leave the Palestinians to their own devices, the PA may well collapse, or Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation may well collapse, and that isn't particularly good for Israel. If you could think of it like this, from Israel's perspective, and indeed America's allies in the whole region, when the United States takes a step backwards, as it did under Obama, the forces that fill that vacuum are either those of instability, those who are less friendly to Israel, or those who are more hostile to Israel. And that, it would seem to me, is the great danger. Now, it's unclear whether Mr. Trump will actually take this view. Or whether the contradictions that I've spoken about will be resolved one way or another, or whether policy will simply be incoherent. It wouldn't be the first time that US policy was incoherent on such things. What I would like to see, and I think is a more realistic approach, is this is not going to be an administration that promotes a liberal agenda, but it could promote a Henry Kissinger-style order. And what would a Henry Kissinger-style order look like? It would say, look, the first thing you have to do, it's after Vietnam, and the Americans don't want to be so engaged, but you need to be engaged, you need to maintain order in the Middle East, so you go to your allies. America's allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, etc., feel that the confidence they felt in America has fallen. America needs to reassure those allies, show that it's there, show that it's willing to push back against an Iran which will have more money available to cause more trouble, be willing to be more forceful and more assertive in pushing back against Iranian mischief in the region, maybe even using a limited force to stop the supply of arms to Hezbollah and others. Work with your allies to come up with contingency plans to use force if Iran breaks the agreement, or as we reach the threshold in 10 to 15 years where the Iranians will be very close to the bomb. On the peace process, between doing nothing and going for an all-out agreement, there are things that you can do. There is a kind of nascent sense, both in the Israeli government and in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, that somehow talking about the Arab League plan could be an umbrella under which to increase cooperation between Israel and America's allies, and coordinate it and move it, therefore, into a stronger sense of being able to push back against Iran. But without American leadership, that is much less likely to happen. And perhaps one other thing that I think is possible and will be positive is a bilateral understanding between Israel and the United States over settlement construction. There's been an idea going around since the peace process collapsed in the Kerry effort that Israel and the United States should reach an understanding about Israel not building outside the main settlement blocks. And that would have the effect of holding open the option of a two-state solution on the ground, while admitting that right now it's unlikely that we can negotiate a two-state solution. The Obama administration was not in favor of this because they didn't want to make any kind of distinction between any kind of settlements. But I think it would be a step forward. It's interesting that even Israel's hawkish Minister Lieberman has floated this idea. The idea has been floated by some in Washington, it's been floated by others close to Netanyahu. So I think solid steps, or maybe not dramatic, are things that should be attempted, and one can only hope that there will be some kind of coherent policy that will bring the sides together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was bracing and comprehensive. Dana.
Thank you. Well, I think Jonathan, first of all, I agree with a great deal that Jonathan just laid out in his analysis. We've written two books that were obviously published before the election of Donald Trump, and I think they share a great deal of analysis, although they certainly have different emphases and conclusions about the likely evolution of the U.S.-Israeli alliance. I mean, the basic argument in our book that I co-authored with Steve Simon was that what we call the psychodrama of the Obama and Netanyahu years should not be analyzed in terms of these two men. In other words, they reflected underlying trends in both countries, and therefore they were unlikely to be cured by the departure of one or both of them from the scene. Now, I came into this. I came into work today prepared to make a confession, and the confession was that the name Donald Trump did not appear in the index of our book, even though it was finalized as the primaries were gathering momentum, and indeed there was a lot of evidence that Donald Trump would be the nominee, but we weren't, like many people, we weren't taking this seriously. In any event, we really couldn't conceive of him being elected president. So, although it was an obviously dramatic moment in American political history, we nonetheless felt fairly confident, and there's a long lead time in books. So anyway, that was the confession I was going to make. Except I actually looked in the index as I was coming, and I found he did appear in the index. He appeared twice. And they were both footnotes, sort of corresponding to our view that Trump was going to kind of be a footnote. But they were footnotes referring to the actual poisonous nature of American politics vis-a-vis minorities and vis-a-vis relationship to particularly Muslims. In one, we were just giving a kind of summary. Actually, it was borrowed from Michael Gearson about how the Republican Party had become so virulently and really bigotedly, if that's not a word, anti-Muslim, and at one, we included the line from. I'm trying to see now where it is, but Donald Trump, these statements, I think, we insisted came before Donald Trump had actually proposed banning Muslims from the United States. And then in another one, we just noted, this again is a footnote, an endnote. Donald Trump, campaigning in late 2005 in the Republican presidential primary campaign, said he would, quote, go after the family members of Islamist terrorists because family members, quote, know what's happening. In an interview, he said, I would certainly go after the wives who absolutely know what was happening, and I guess your definition of what I do, I'm going to leave to your imagination. Then I looked at the text, what that footnote referred to. I mean, it's not that I can't remember anything in my book, but it was trying to look at potential evolutions, and it had this sentence, which is the only place where the word Trump appears in the index. And it said, in the worst case, the United States and Israel could be joined darkly in a kind of shared Trumpismo. Anyway, that was the only reference. But the point is that, this was a worst case that we really didn't think was going to happen, but it presented a kind of option in terms of, a strategic and moral melding of the two countries, which was actually the opposite of what we actually expected to see happen. Now, of course, we're in a situation where Trump is going to be president of the United States, where we could conceivably have an alliance between the most illiberal elements of both society, based on a shared convictions that are not obviously wrong, completely wrong, but I think in strategic emphasis for the United States probably wrong, that Islamist terrorism, together with Iran's growing power, are the most dangerous challenges for both countries. I acknowledge and even agree with what Jonathan said about making the distinction between Islamist terrorism and Iran's growing power, and the implicit idea that what we've heard of Trump's program suggests that he might be more interested in one than the other. But I'm trying to look at the main lines of Republican foreign policy, which have tended to lump them together. And so the idea is that, this is an idea you could take from Trump's ascendance, that the two countries can be joined by this sense of common enemy. And not really worry about the things that caused such consternation in the Obama administration, including settlements, construction, and expansion, which in the view of the Obama administration, I was about to use the past tense, but it still is the Obama administration, and it believes that these are rapidly killing the chance for a two-state solution. Now, of course, there was a reaction in Israel to the election of Trump, and I think there was a degree of nuance in it that Jonathan has properly expressed. There was, of course, some nuanced reaction. For example, Naftali Bennett said that Trump's victory is a tremendous opportunity for Israel to immediately announce its intention to renege on the idea of establishing Palestine in the heart of the country, a direct blow to our security and the justice of our cause. This is the president-elect's outlook as it appears in the platform. It's true, the idea of a two-state solution was excised from the Republican platform, and that definitely should be our way. Salient, simple, and clear. The era of the Palestinian state is over. Now, I'm not suggesting that this represents, the Israeli government or Israeli direction, but it is one reaction, and we can discuss. And Jonathan obviously is, much more knowledgeable about this than I am, but we can discuss to the extent to which this presages the direction of Israeli politics in general. Anyway, look, this is sort of what I would say. To the extent that Bennett is right about a Trump administration's attitude, I would argue partly along the lines of what Jonathan was saying, but actually much more urgently, that this is very dangerous for Israel and for the U.S.-Israeli alliance. And I'll just say very briefly, sort of give you three reasons. First, the two-state solution could definitively die in the next 4 or 8 years. There are arguments that it's dead already, but unrestrained settlement activity, sort of the de facto annexation of the West Bank, which I think is what Bennett would like to see, will fundamentally change not only the nature of Israel's democracy, but the relationship of that democracy. I'm not saying it will end Israeli democracy. I'm saying it will change the possibilities and the nature of that democracy, and almost inevitably change the relationship of that democracy to American democracy. What we call in our book the long-standing mirror imaging between the two countries will become much more difficult. Second, And, you can, the second argument I'm about to make, you can look at as a kind of denial on my part. But, even if the Electoral College in the United States has surprised us again, nothing that happened in this election, in my view, invalidates the trends that my co-author and I talk about in our book, which is an emerging liberal majority in the United States. It is absolutely true, it is politically completely in the wilderness, but it is a majority. This is what polls suggest, and it is not irrelevant that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by over 2 million votes, which is a higher margin of victory than 7 American presidents, including 5 of them who actually won, more than 7 American presidents. I was doing my math wrong. There's several winners of the popular vote, about 5 who, or 6, I think. I'm confused. That, like Clinton, did not win the presidency. But the generational and demographic and political changes in the United States are really moving it away from the pro-Zionist generation that I represent. And I'm not particularly impressed, I don't mean to put it that way, but the fact that polling does continue to show, as Jonathan said, that Israel is pretty popular in the United States, does not necessarily refute the notion that I have, which is that change, when it comes, can come very, very quickly. And in fact, the election of Donald Trump, on a host of different issues, the repudiation of free trade, the repudiation of the American commitment to NATO, all of these things show that things that were deemed to be part of the American DNA can suddenly become not very important. This goes in tandem with changes in an Israeli society that is also very divided, but in which it seems that demographically the right, the more religious elements of the society are on an upward trend. I'm not really prepared to make any particular predictions about how this would play out. I'm just suggesting that it could be dangerous, and it's already injected a danger into American politics. America is extremely polarized across a host of issues, and for the first time, that polarization has pertained to our relationship with Israel. And you saw this throughout, I think, the nuances of it can be the subject of a debate, but I think it was pretty clear to me as an American that the Israeli Prime Minister in the 2012 election, was playing a gambit of intervening on the side of one party, which is not unheard of, by the way. The United States, of course, U.S. administrations have happily intervened in Israeli politics, but I think it was slightly more dangerous in this case. In any event, this was noticed on the Democratic side, which on a host of issues was more likely, as Jonathan said, to have issues with Israel. Sorry, I'm looking at your watch because I don't have one. And I would just put to you the scenario that a Trumpian embrace of the Israeli right is also going to have a boomerang effect on the center-left in the United States, because Trump looks likely to be a very, very unpopular and very, very polarizing president. And to the extent that Israel is an issue in that polarization, I think Trump will make it worse. Now, the third point, I think, is something that Jonathan has already alluded to. There are various ways that even if you only look at Trump's voters and Trump's program, I think you should be concerned. If I were an ally that depended on American protection, I would be concerned. I mean, one place which is, of course, cultural is that he has been associated with a degree of bigotry and demonization of minorities that has been very, very worrying to American Jews. Now, this is in a sense part of the second category I was talking about. I mean, I don't think that, there's no evidence that Donald Trump is personally an anti-Semite, but he has definitely aroused a degree of anti-Semitism that goes along with the other kinds of xenophobia and racism that his campaign has, promoted and energized, certainly. And this I think is again going to, as I say, the whole sort of ecosystem of American Jewish support for Israel is not the only source of American support, and you can argue it's not even the most important American source, but it is becoming more ambivalent, I think, than ever before. But really, what I really wanted to get to was Trump's view of alliances, and Jonathan's already talked about this. I mean, he has had a consistent worldview. It really goes back for the 30 years or so that he's been a kind of public figure. It is entirely transactional. It is genuinely isolationist. We don't know if he'll be an isolationist president, but he has certainly been an isolationist candidate, the first one. And the further point I would make is that if he brings the most extreme hard line to American foreign policy and national security strategy, this would be, we can call it Jacksonian, but it's a Jacksonian combination of belligerence and isolationism that is going to be counter-strategic to U.S. interests in the sense that it makes our problem with the Muslim world, if I can use that expression, much, much worse. We recognize that as a counter-strategic kind of own goal in the Bush administration. But of course, George W. Bush was nothing like Donald Trump. I think he contributed to a very poisonous American problem with the world's Muslims, but he recognized he didn't want to. He actually wanted to, consciously prevent this. But if you put somebody like Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, who has called Islam, not Islamic extremism, Islam, a diseased religion, we don't know where this is going to go, but so far it's going in a very, very worrying direction for America's overall strategic interests. So I would just conclude by saying that, obviously the administration is unformed. Donald Trump is not a blank slate, but we can hope or imagine that his presidency, aside from appointments he's already made, has been a blank slate. There was an article in the New York Times today that I think perfectly reveals the very, very different directions this administration might go. One was, and it referred to the fact that there is I think the Times used the word caustic infighting in the Trump team about the choice of Secretary of State between Rudolph Giuliani and Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, I assume, would be a choice. It would be a difficult choice. He called Donald Trump a con man and a fraud and many other things, so it would be difficult to choose him. But if he did, it would be a strong signal and a strong possibility that mainstream traditional American foreign policy, traditional Republican American foreign policy, would at least have a voice and a direct and some sort of presence in the Trump administration. And that mainstream Republican foreign policy, I assume, would revert to, I'm talking about the State Department now, not the entire administration, but it would keep America committed to a policy of both friendship with Israel, strong friendship with Israel, and maintenance of consistent American policies involving a two-state solution and particularly opposition to Israeli settlements. I have no idea who's going to be Secretary of State, but I think that would be a key indicator. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. We have a little bit more than 20 minutes for questions. I want to take questions in groups of 3, and I want to ask you both one each to start with. Jonathan, you talked about an undercurrent of nervousness about what a Trump administration might mean. When states get nervous about allies, they often look around for long-term alternatives. What are Israel's options in a world where the United States is more unreliable? And on a related theme, with Russia a much more active player in the region, what are Israeli-Russian relations going to look like in this sort of more uncertain environment? And to Dana, it feels a bit academic to talk about it now, but just talking about the Democrats' attitude towards Israel, how significant do you think the debate about Israel in the Democratic primary campaign was? What do you think we can learn from that? Okay. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes, sir. And if you would introduce yourself.
Yes. My name is Katani. I am originally from Iran. And I worked in nuclear field. My question is about the relation between Israel and Palestine, because I think that's the main problem. If this problem is solved, many things about relation with Arab states, America is solved also. What are the problems in this thing? My question.
John, why don't you go first?
Okay. Russia. Okay, the first thing is there's a lot of rubbish spoken in Israel in public about, different alternatives if America withdraws, but it's rubbish. There is no alternative for Israel that is as good as the relationship with the United States, not by a long stretch. You just need to remember that the United States has more military power than the next 4 or 5 countries put together. America has 10 aircraft carriers. The Russians have 1. It doesn't work properly. The Chinese have 1, which they bought recently. Italy, I think, has 2. That's it, right? I think one other country has 2. So in terms of global ability to project power, there is no alternative. There is no alternative. Israel is now so much stronger than it was, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the 1970s, American aid to Israel reached 15 to 20% of GDP. It's now 1%. 1% is not nothing. It can affect Israeli politics if it wasn't there. But Israel can survive without it, right? Israel has better relationships with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and they become tighter if the US takes a step backwards because we have to look after ourselves. We all face common threats. But there is no alternative. Without American leadership, these things can fall apart very quickly. When the Iran deal starts to allow Iran to reach zero breakout time in 10 to 15 years, what if the Saudis decide to go nuclear? Are they still in alliance with Israel, or is that as threatening to Israel as Iran going nuclear? The Russians, the best that you have with the Russians is a deconflicting agreement, right? You don't do this, we don't do that. We avoid each other's thing. Everything else is very, very limited. The Russians still vote at the UN how they vote at the UN. They're still talking about a $10 billion aid deal, a military sales deal with the Iranians. So there is no strategic alternative. Israel can manage, but managing is not at the moment. If you think of it, that the seas are relatively calm. As the United States does less, the seas become rougher, a lot rougher. On the Israeli-Palestinian thing, I think it's just easier to say what aren't the problems, rather than what are the problems. I don't think there's anyone who seriously thinks that there's a serious chance of a permanent status agreement now, for a whole host of reasons. some of which are to do with the domestic politics of the party, some of which to do with even with the best will, when there was the best will, that as one person who was very close to negotiations told me, it's like this was under Ulmer in 2008, it's like two magnets that have the same polarity. However close you get, when it gets to the, you get down to a difference of, 6.5% to 2.5% swap on territory, but you can't make it touch. And, you can look at the issues on Jerusalem, or you could look at the issues on refugees or on security. But I just think at the end of the day, the will isn't there for that kind of thing. I'm not sure I don't think the ability to deliver is there. So the question is, what do you do, when you don't have that? I'm gonna control myself and not answer the question that you asked Dana, even though a large part of my book deals with that. But I shall leave it to him.
Well, Dana, why don't you go first? And if Jonathan, you
yeah,
can't
you might
restrain
want to
yourself,
add
you
something.
can.
I'm actually going to control. I'm not going to control myself because I would like to say something about this idea of broader strategic strategic realignment involving Israel. I mean, I certainly agree that the idea is rubbish, and I don't know. And when you say a lot of this rubbish is spoken, I'm wondering if they know it's rubbish, which is a different question, because it does have an effect. Now, but this effect is, I think, related to maybe a disagreement that we have about what the United States has been doing for the last 8 years in the Middle East. The word withdrawal is used often, and I think you used it, partial withdrawal, presumably, retrenchment. I actually think it's less than that and more than that. The United States hasn't withdrawn from anywhere except withdrawing ground troops from a war, an invasion in Iraq. The United States strategic, there was a lot of hand-wringing about a period when an aircraft carrier was missing from the Persian Gulf, word I grew up with. But I haven't, the basic American strategic presence is still there. What is different, and this is underlying and very serious, is basic strategic disagreement with our traditional allies, including Israel. What have these disagreements been about? I mean, in the case of not with Israel, but with Saudi Arabia, they've been about the question of engaging the United States decisively in a proxy war in Syria. I don't know that I know the Israelis were very unhappy and disheartened by the specific Red Line incident, but I don't know that they particularly wanted the United States to engage in this proxy war, but the Saudis definitely do. And the United States doesn't want to, and I don't think this reflects so much a withdrawal as a completely different strategic reading of that situation and what can be accomplished. There have been strategic disagreements with Saudi and, of course, with Israel about what to do about Iran. And this was a basic disagreement involving, two very different strategies. One of, never giving up the pressure and possibly leading to war. I'm sure there's a theory about how it wouldn't lead to war and Iran would simply relent. But, that was at least a very different strategic perspective. The United States didn't think they would relent on the basis of the kind of surrender that it seems that Jerusalem and Riyadh wanted to see. So the United States took a strategic decision that if they could get this deal for a period of over a decade, that would be a very reliable deal. This would be a huge strategic gain, but I know that was a big disagreement. Those are the two big ones. But I think that, possibly in terms of the Israeli view of, other options, it's not the view that, I take your point that it's not a view that the United States, that Israel can find a substitute for the United States, but maybe there is a view that the United States is not as reliable anymore. And connections with Russia, to take one example, will not come with the same sort of baggage, including hectoring about settlements and the treatment of Palestinians. It was noted that when the United States was rounding up votes to condemn Russia's annexation of Ukraine, Israel was absent. Annexation of Crimea. That, I think, was viewed as a problem in the United States. It may be less of a problem when we have an administration that may be willing to recognize the annexation of Crimea. I don't actually think that'll happen, but they'll be less concerned about it. Anyway, that's my answering the wrong question. How significant was the debate in democratic politics? I'm trying to anticipate Jonathan's counter to what I'm going to say. I think it was very significant. But it's not a significance that you will see necessarily in voting behavior among Democratic congressmen anytime soon. I acknowledge that. But I think it is, I argued that America is still moving inexorably to the left. Recent evidence strongly contradicts that, but I think the trends are still there. What I really don't think is deniable is that the Democratic Party is moving to the left, and it's moving to the left in ways that have some. Israel-Palestine is not an important part of that, but it was really striking. I mean, we've had New York State Democratic primaries where Israel and alleged insufficient devotion to Israel was a very radioactive charge and was used quite effectively by Al Gore, for example. In this Democratic primary, the effort and the actual debate between the two Democratic candidates was who could say more about their support for the Palestinians. And my point is that there was the traditional constituency in New York that would come down like a hammer blow on someone for that was completely missing. And I do think that's a significant harbinger of what democratic politics is likely to begin, and it has to do with the evolution, specifically in New York. It has to do with the evolution of of a large part, the majority part of the American Jewish community. Now, of course, there is a smaller, very right-wing politically, which overlaps to an extent, although not entirely, with Orthodox religious practice in the United States, which is not part of what I'm talking about. Again, I'm not really willing to predict how this will play out in specific votes or specific mechanisms, but it does seem to me that AIPAC and Prime Minister Netanyahu were counting on a vote on the Iran nuclear deal going on a different way among Democratic congressmen and Democratic senators in this case. And it didn't happen, and that could be significant for the future.
Jonathan, you want to weigh in?
Yes, this is a major trend that I was talking about 5-6 years ago in Washington. No one believed me. I said, look, I'm reading the polls, I'm reading the liberal journals where people write before they go into office. So it wasn't actually happening, but you could see a generation was thinking differently. I think that there is a failure to appreciate this in Israel, that what's happened is, there are many more conservatives in America than there are liberals, but each generation is more liberal. And when Al Gore was the candidate in 2000, the largest group of Democrats were moderates, and there were almost as many conservative Democrats as liberal. The largest group now are liberals, and it's over twice the number of conservatives. Each generation is most liberal. This is the first American generation since 1945 to be more liberal, those millennials, those who come to maturity after the year 2000, that is more liberal than conservative. Now, in every poll, apart from one that was taken last year, every single American demographic is more sympathetic to Israel than to the Palestinians, right? So the differences were always policy. 2 states, Iran deal. One poll by Pew this year, for the first time, came out with more liberal Democrats. Remember, liberal Democrats, just under half of all Democrats, were more sympathetic to the Palestinians than Israelis. Some of that is to do with underlying trends. Some of it is to do with the Prime Minister going to Congress in March 2015 and looking like this is a partisan act on behalf of the Republicans over the Iran deal. Now, whether it was or it wasn't, it was a huge miscalculation. And the polling before and after that move showed a really significant shift on attitudes. Now, that can change. But I think that underlying trend is very much there. If you look at the Iran deal, what you said is true. What happened was President Obama went to these Democratic senators and he said to them, I will primary you if you vote against me on the deal. And when those senators looked at their publics, they said among Democrats, there was great support for the deal, and it was greatly linked to sort of loyalty to the president. It wasn't that everyone thought the deal was marvelous, but it was like a tribal vote. And that meant that Netanyahu, AIPAC, couldn't compete with it. Now, AIPAC told Netanyahu that he was going to lose if he did it like this, but he didn't listen. He thought he knew better. So I think that this is an issue. And just to give you an idea how it's not understood in Israel, when you poll Israelis about why do you think America's so supportive, the number one reason is strategic interest. You ask Americans, number one interest is strategic interest. Then, pro-Israel lobby. But whereas for about 30% of Americans, the reason you've got to support Israel is because of shared democratic values. For Israelis, they rated that at about 10%. In other words, there is a shortfall in Israel of understanding the political significance of that element of the relationship, and that shortfall happens to be strongest among the people who are supportive of the current Israeli government.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, Alan Johnson, editor of Fathom. I want to push Jonathan on a couple of points.
Yep.
First of all, there's a case that you were very optimistic about what's going to happen around settlements, in that, okay, Lieberman, the defense minister, did make an offer, but you should remember what the offer actually was. It was US recognition of the blocks in return for a temporary freeze. So we might think, well, that's pushing it. That's really asking for a lot there. What then happened next was that he was denounced by the Jewish Home Party, and the Likud took out a full-page advert with all the ministers' photographs in the advert, and underneath their faces were quotes saying, we will build wherever we want to build, Lieberman is doing the wrong thing, and so on. So that's the reality of how difficult that would be to push. And that links to, again, to partly push you, partly play devil's advocate. You talked about continuity being likely in terms of policy and so on, right? Strong elements of continuity. I think there's a case that I did a New York Times op-ed, wrote it the day before the election, appeared the day after the election, and I started it with a line which wasn't mine, which was that things will now be changed utterly. And I think there is a case that's likely. No US pressure upon an Israeli government means Netanyahu hasn't got a card that he's always played, which is to his right, I'm really with you guys, but I can't do what you want because I've got the Americans on my back and they're saying I can't do this. And the Israeli public, even the right-wing public, understand that argument. If that card's taken away, if there is a rush around settlement expansion, if there's moves to redesignate the settler population in the West Bank as some kind of protected population, which would change everything, then that's a new world, I think, in terms of not just the settlement issue, but from the settlement issue to the whole two-state paradigm. And I also think if Israel goes down that route, this relates to what we've been saying, that Israel will be much less attractive to the kind of younger Americans and millennials that you're talking about. So I appreciate not everything's going to change your mind, but I think there is we don't know, but there is a case, I think, that this constellation means some dramatic changes are possible.
Thank you.
Do you want me to answer or do you want to wait?
Let's see if we have any more time.
Just a question for Dr. Ryan. So, maybe there's a withdrawal from, Georgia and I work at AAS as well. from the Middle East. You see this sort of tentative emergence of the Gulf states working together in places like Yemen. And I'm just wondering, don't really know what Israel's stance is on that conflict and the Gulf states' role there. So
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Oh, sorry.
probably squeeze in one more if there are any, and that'll be yes, sir.
David Cricker from David Cricker Communications. We've had a lot post-Trump selection about post-fact politics, and I suppose it's originating with analysis of Putin. Now we've got Trump, and I was just wondering where you think Bibi Netanyahu fits in a world of post-fact politics, and have Israel actually got a great man if we are entering such a world? Is he a post-fact prime minister?
Okay, I'm going to give Jonathan a moment to think on all of those. Dana, if you want to weigh in on any of those points first.
I'm not going to touch the last one, but let me try to just respond to Alan Johnson's comments by saying that I agree with him, which I guess won't be a surprise. But I also think it gets to something that is, really a central misunderstanding between, has been a central misunderstanding between the United States and Israel, and that is, why do we care so much about the settlements? Why is that? I mean, there are many Israelis who will say, look, we pulled out of Gaza, we uprooted settlements, but I mean, it's clear that some elements of what you might call the settler lobby, see it in strategic terms, and that Israel, for decades, or Israelis for decades, I don't mean Israel, for decades has seen it in strategic terms, which is that you do create facts on the ground that make alternatives impossible, and it is, that slip of the tongue I just used is really crucial here, where I wanted to say the way Israel sees it. Well, of course, no country sees something as a unitary actor. But the United States, in dealing with its closest, one of its very closest allies, has no idea at the end of the day what Israel's strategic plan is. I mean, it can't, because Israel probably doesn't know. What it can only respond to is indeed those facts on the ground. And it's fairly clear even that some Israelis think this is to rule out a Palestinian state, and others have long seen it as a kind of bargaining chip, although it's not, to my view, is not a very logical bargaining chip. So, I mean, I guess that's just my tone of agreement with Alan. Now, this could change very significantly in a Trump administration, except that, again, I don't know what a Trump administration, just like I don't know what Israel thinks, I don't know what a Trump administration thinks. I do know that there are Republicans who have had strong voices, and maybe not decisive voices, but strong voices in the party, who view the idea of a Palestinian state on the West Bank as nonsense on stilts, and would be perfectly willing to ally with a project of making that impossible. But it hasn't up till now included any Republican president. I mean, you remember that when Yasser Arafat died, the first thing that George W. Bush did was he went to Ariel Sharon and said, look, he's dead. Now we have to do something. And Sharon, tragically might have done something, I don't know, but he was incapacitated in the process. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, so, Alan. Yeah. What I've said is a possibility, not necessarily a probability, but I want to unpack what you said and turn it around. If they weren't really scared, i.e. if the Likud and Jewish Home were not really scared about this, they wouldn't have reacted like that. They didn't react with horror at the roadmap because They didn't think the road map was going anywhere. What are they scared of? They're scared of this. Around Netanyahu are two groups of people. Those who are more pragmatically inclined and those who are more ideologically inclined. Nobody knows what the Prime Minister thinks. He might have a difference between his head and his heart. Okay? But we don't know. Now, what are those who speak with the head? They're the ones who are putting forward this deal. Now, they know Lieberman's not stupid. He's many things, but stupid isn't one of them. And he knows that what he says at the beginning will not be what will be at the end. So I don't think there's much. I mean, this is this is the way he sells it. What would come out at the end would be different. That's not what's being spoken about. That's not the idea. He's just thrown it out. The real thing is this: there's been many, many attempts to get to bring Labour into the coalition. Herzog wants it. Netanyahu wants it. They understand what that would mean in terms of parameters and something on settlements, because the issue is this, that Herzog can't get Labour into the government because they don't trust Netanyahu, so they want it all written down. And the Likud don't want it, and Bibi doesn't want it all written down because he knows if it is, he's going to have to have a fight with Jewish Home and Likud. Now he doesn't mind if the Jewish Home leave the government, that's fine from his point of view. But he's a very, very cautious man. He's not like Ariel Sharon, who just say, I don't care about Likud, I'll form another party, I couldn't care less. That's not him. And so he's very cautious. Now the question is, if what was going in that equation was that when the idea was put to Washington, Obama wasn't interested. Now, if you have a president, if you'd have had Hillary Clinton, who might have been interested in that, I think that would have changed the dynamic, because then the trust issue between Herzog and Netanyahu dissipates. Because if an American president picks it up, that's a different thing. Who knows what Trump will do? It's just too... But the option is there, and that's why, without being optimistic or pessimist, I'm saying it's a serious possibility. Yeah, more than that you can't say, because for someone like Lieberman, who is not left wing, he is a deep-seated partitionist. For him, remember, he comes from a part of Europe where the Hungarians and the Romanians were at each other. For him, partition after 1945, right, is the key. You need partition, not because we believe in the rights of self-determination of nations like a good liberal, but simply because we don't think people can live together. So you have to go like that. So he is strategically committed to these things in a different logic, but in one which practically doesn't have a huge difference on it.
Dana is signaling for.
When you finish this part, I'd like to add something.
Okay. So the only other things I was going to say is just that on the withdrawal thing, I would say it's less withdrawal and less assertive. And when you're less assertive about your power, even if you're present, it is a kind of withdrawal. Not in the sense, yes, of course they're there.
Okay, but I mean that again is a fundamental strategic disagreement about
Yes.
how to use power and the efficacy of power, which may change now. Can I just say, because you had other questions that were directed towards you, but before you move on to them, this idea of, and I don't actually know the parameters of a deal mooted where the United States would accept the blocks, which obviously we had a kind of version of in the George W. Bush letter.
Yes.
There is another huge problem with that, which is that the United States, not as much as Israel, but the United States has a Palestinian problem. And the problem comes down to the famous line of Aaron David Miller,
Right.
which is that the United States throughout this process has been Israel's lawyer, and that's true. The general view is that the United States finds out what can its client Israel accept, what's Israel's bottom line, and then it goes to the Palestinians. And this would be another example of that. And we don't talk much about the dysfunctions of the Palestinians, which are legion, as I think you mentioned, but the idea that the United States could, basically, under these terms, acknowledge Israel's map, when I assume Israel's not actually going to present a map, which, it has been absolutely reluctant to do. But basically, this imaginary map would have the imprimatur of the United States, and then we go to the Palestinians to try to make a deal. I think that would be...
No, it wouldn't be like that. It would be much less formal. That's why they talk about an understanding, not a deal.
I understand that, but it would be accepting this concept, Israel's map of what that solution is going to be, without actually seeing the map.
So I just think it's like this. It's simply that you are, by something is better than nothing. There is no negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians. It's not going to happen.
But I assume this includes aerial.
It may or may not, but even if it does, let's say it does.
Yeah.
Will that change the fact that if we waved our magic wands tomorrow and there was a possibility of negotiation, that Ariel finger would be part of Israel? I don't believe it. I don't think there's anything that would happen. Do you see what I'm saying? Yes, you're right. It's not perfect. Ariel would be the classic problem, as would some other bits, 100%. But if you're saying for a 2% or 1.5% of the West Bank problem, you're gonna not resolve, and for 85 to 90% that you are gonna, if you change it also on Area C. Area C is a big deal, right? The Jewish home want Area C, where at the moment Israel has civilian and military control. They want to basically annex that. The other option, which would be to say, is Israel expands civilian control and gives it over to the Palestinians in Area C, and thereby signals its intention. In other words, this is a security issue. It's not a further issue. So there are things that we can do that are not perfect, that America can't accept formally. There can only be informal understandings. Right. They are not perfect. They create certain problems. But do they create less problems than they do advantages? I say yes.
Okay. Well, I'll just conclude by saying, whatever I think about it, and the problems I see in it, I accept and agree that this was not an option. I don't think it would have been an option under a Hillary Clinton administration. But in any event, there's no Hillary Clinton administration, right. So I think that although I'm skeptical of its utility, right. I accept that it might happen. Okay.
Well,
from the American point of view. Yeah.
Some things in life are non-negotiable, and one of them is the passage of time.
Sorry, and I took up your
I want to give Jonathan just 2 minutes to come back to the other questions. One on Gulf state interventionism and how Israel feels about that. And lastly, whether Bibi Netanyahu is a post-fact prime minister. But if you can keep it to sort of 90 seconds, 2 minutes.
90 seconds, fine. The Gulf. Yes, Israel wants more cooperation with the Gulf. The big question is it prepared to at least do some semblance of something diplomatically with the Arab League plan and peace process, some sort of thing, to enable that to go forward? It's an open question, but there are voices saying that they should do that. If there's a Herzog government, that will happen. That's one of the things they're talking about. But at the moment, there isn't. Okay. The other issue, post-truth politics. I don't think Netanyahu really fits that mold. People vote for Netanyahu because despite the fact that they don't like him, they think he's the most able to provide Israelis with security. That's really what it comes down to. The rest of it, the only thing that can change the electoral map in Israel is that the centrists are so angry that the ultra-Orthodox are getting more money and doing less work and getting out of the deals of the last government. That anger is the only thing that can move electorates from one place to the other. But you have to have a candidate on the centre or the left who crosses the threshold on security. If they don't cross that threshold, if they're not seen as able and willing to deal with that, then people won't allow themselves to vote on the second issue down the agenda.
Excellent, thank you. This has been a really good discussion. In fact, it's been so good that I would like to urge everybody here to go out immediately and buy both of these authors' books. Jonathan's is The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture. Dana and Steve Simons is Our Separate Ways, The Struggle for the Future of the US-Israel Alliance. All that remains is to ask you to join me in thanking our two speakers.